So first, let's start talking about the Mogollon. Here, you'll notice I say the development of the Ancestral Pueblo communities. Well, the first cultural group is known as the Mogollon, and eventually they'll develop into the Ancestral Pueblo culture. And so around 200 CE, you're going to see a shift from a nomadic way of life or semi-permanent way of life to permanent villages, living in permanent villages. And so you'll have the Mogollon moving into these pit houses is where they'll live in these villages. And so these are some pictures of pit houses. Right, this is like a diagram of a pit house, just to give you an idea of what they look like. And so if you can tell by looking at the picture, the pit house is mostly located underground. And so you have a hole or a pit basically that's dug about 2 feet to 5 feet deep into the earth. And then you have these long wooden branches that are going to make the roof, and then that'll be covered with smaller branches, and then eventually wattle and daub, this kind of mud covering on the outside. Okay, and so that's what a pit house would look like. Part of the reason for this, the area where these people were living, where the Mogollon lived, is, could be very hot at times. Living in the pit houses would give them protection from the heat. All right, and so this is your general construction of a pit house. Also, in these permanent villages of the Mogollon, you're going to start to see a special pit house being made for ceremonial purposes, and these are believed to be the prototype of the modern-day kivas. Even today, in Pueblo culture, ceremonies are conducted inside of a kiva, these kind of pit houses where you have ceremonies take place, and so it's believed that that tradition begins early on with the Mogollons, right, where they were beginning to use these pit houses, at least one in each village, for ceremonial purposes. Another change in climate is going to affect the lifestyles of the Mogollon, and this is where you're going to start to see that transition from Mogollon culture into the Ancestral Pueblo culture. Basically, the Mogollon will be uniting with peoples from the north and to create this Ancestral Pueblo culture. And so the change in climate is going to be an increase in summer rainfall. Okay, so more and more you're going to see more rainfall coming in the summer, and this is going to allow the Ancestral Pueblo to leave certain areas and expand into new areas that hadn't been cultivated for agriculture before. And this is all going to take place around 900 CE. Okay, and so now that means an expansion into new areas, because since there's so much rain in the summer, you can grow food in new areas, and so that's why you're starting to see an expansion into new settlements. Also during this time, you're going to start to see a shift as we see the transition from the Mogollon into the Ancestral Pueblo culture, a shift from living in pit houses to living in multi-storied apartments in some cases. And so you see this shift towards living in these multi-storied apartments, right? So 2 stories, 3 stories high with a number of different rooms. Sometimes there could be hundreds of rooms in these apartments. And you start to see that shift take place as people start to move from the living in pit houses to living in these multi-storied apartments. Possibly it was for protection, why you see that shift in habitats, living in a different type of structure. Okay, so now as we're starting to see the development of this Ancestral Pueblo culture, people living in multi-story apartments, moving to new areas because of the summer rainfall and growing crops still. Let's take a look at an example of one of these ceremonial centers of the Ancestral Pueblo people. And so one of the more famous ones is called Chaco Canyon, located in modern-day New Mexico. And within the area of Chaco Canyon, you have the ceremonial center known as Pueblo Bonito. Okay, and so it's really actually not just a ceremonial center. You see the ruins of it here, but there was actually a whole network of villages and towns connected to the ceremonial center through a road network. So basically there was a number of different communities that were all connected together in the area of Chaco Canyon, with Pueblo Bonito being this main ceremonial center here. Okay. Now, in Pueblo Bonito, you had roughly about 300 people living there. Okay, so it wasn't like a major population center, but it was more of a ceremonial center and a place where the elite resided. And so, who are the elite? Well, it is believed that these elite members, these 300 or so people who lived in Pueblo Bonito within Chaco Canyon, were administrators who had a number of different duties. Three of their main duties would be one, to control the distribution of water to the surrounding communities, the villages and towns. Water, of course, very important. It's not super wet, even though the rainfall has increased during the summer in the southwest. It's still sort of a dry area, and so water is a very precious thing at this time for these agricultural communities, right? To grow your crops, you need water. And so it is believed that these elite administrators that lived in Pueblo Bonito were responsible for controlling the distribution of water to the villages and towns and communities nearby surrounding it that were connected to it through this road network. Okay, so very important, that water. Without it, how are you going to grow your crops? You got to make sure that you get your allotment of water so your crops will grow, so your community can thrive. Okay. Another thing that the elite administrators who lived in Pueblo Bonito were responsible for was controlling trade. The Ancestral Pueblo in general were responsible for a trade network that was connected to Mesoamerica as well as other areas. We'll talk a little bit about their connection to the Hohokam in a little bit. And so trade is another important thing. So the production of trade goods, such as the mining of turquoise, was all under the control of these elite administrators, right, who would live in the ceremonial centers, such as the one at Pueblo Bonito. And then finally, the elite administrators were responsible for controlling religious ceremonies, right? So they were most likely leading the religious ceremonies here at Pueblo Bonito. So people from the surrounding communities would travel here to the ceremonial center of Pueblo Bonito to take part in ceremonies in the kivas that were located there. Okay. So you're starting to get an idea of what this civilization was like, right? So you have little villages and then bigger towns and then the big ceremonial centers that were the center of these areas, and they were controlling the distribution of water, and there was trade going on, and of course religious ceremonies. Okay. But eventually, the civilization there at Chaco Canyon went into decline, and one of the main reasons for this begins with climate, and that is going to be a drought. And this drought is eventually going to reduce the amount of agricultural output coming out of the area. And so these communities aren't going to be able to produce as much food as they once did. And that's important because how are you going to sustain large communities without agricultural output? You need it, right? You need that maize, you need the squash, the beans to support those larger populations in those towns and villages, okay, that are all congregated there around Chaco Canyon. So, so the drought is going to bring less rainfall, and so less food. And also this is going to affect the legitimacy or the leadership of those elite administrators who were living in Pueblo Bonito, right? Or at least that's the theory. The scholars believe that because of the lack of rainfall, that's going to damage or hinder one of the duties, one of the important duties of those elite administrators, okay? So there's not enough water for them to distribute to those surrounding communities, and that was part of their power, right? Was that they were controlling those waters. Now, water's not there anymore because of the drought, or at least not in the same capacity that it once was, and so those elite administrators aren't going to be so powerful anymore. You don't have to depend upon them for your water anymore, okay? That whole system is kind of, outdated during that time because of the drought. And so this may have resulted in a loss of legitimacy for those elite administrators. And so this is going to affect their control of the trade, right, in that area. And so we're talking about the production of trade goods, such as turquoise, and conducting trade itself. Those elite administrators controlled that trade before, but now, as their leadership is beginning to weaken, they're starting to lose control of that trade. And so by the 1200s, you're going to start to see the major centers of the Ancestral Pueblo become abandoned, all right? And so the people are going to disperse from those centers and live in other areas where they can survive, right? Because why would you stay in these large population centers when you can't produce enough food to feed all those people? So people would just kind of go out on their own into smaller communities where they could sustain themselves.